Thank you so much for that introduction, Maggie. I really appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about negotiation strategies and tactics. And, when you think about it from the perspective of negotiation, so much of life is a negotiation, and there's so many opportunities for us to practice. And I love what JFK said, because he said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And as I was looking at the Savvy Ladies website, one of the things that struck out to me was the promise to prepare you to make informed decisions about your money so you can live the life you deserve. And in order to do that, right, you need research. You need to understand what you want, map out your objectives. And that process that you do is very similar to the process for preparing for negotiations, right? The only thing is that you're negotiating with your money and yourself as opposed to being with other people. So today I really want us to remember, if anything, if you remember at all, is never forget that every day is a negotiation. We cannot run, we cannot hide from it. So how do we learn to do it better and to do it well? Today, what we're going to talk about is really identifying negotiation styles, techniques to improve your negotiation abilities, and also to help you get clear on desired outcomes prior to the negotiation, during the negotiation, at the end. When we think about it from negotiations, I love in terms of let's first define what we're talking about. So much of the work that I do is based upon building negotiation skills with professionals and business owners. And so when you think about what is a negotiation, it's really a discussion aimed at reaching an agreement, right? Most of us think that, oh my gosh, it's this battle. We put on our armor, you against me. But really, it's a conversation to reach an agreement. So when we think about this discussion and agreement, I also want us to think about this quote from Maya Angelou, because she said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I say this because during negotiations, people show up in many different forms, fashions, and ways that you may have never imagined. And they're showing you and telling you who they are. And as a person in the negotiation process, you don't want to underestimate the person, right? But what you do want to do is do you want to work with them? And these are things you want to think about. What type of relationship do I want at the end of the day? And what are some of the outcomes, right, with this person? So the importance of negotiations, as I said before, that it's everyday life, right? We are negotiating, whether in our personal lives with our children, our pets, our partners, right? In business, we have our vendors, we have our investors, our team members, and business partners. And in personal or business world, in which we fluctuate most often, it's really around how we communicate in our everyday conversation to get the things that we need, right? And again, it's not about this win-lose, lose-win scenario, but really about creating mutual agreeable outcomes, right? Based upon what each of the people in the negotiations need and want. So when we pull it back and talk about vendors in terms of what we're negotiating about, it's pricing maybe, quality, delivery, logistics, timing, right? If you think about it from your investors, yes, it's ROI because you have an investment opportunity, ownership stakes, use of funds, when am I getting my payment back, right? And timing for that. Also, when you're thinking about it from team members, the roles and responsibilities that have to be played, right? Who's doing what? Who's showing up when in terms of scheduling shifts, setting work plans? And all of these things are really important in order for us to function effectively. And then with our business partners, again, maybe ownership and roles. It could also be around how to determine what the right business direction is and strategies to utilize and to execute against. The focus of the business, right? And it was interesting because in my world, there are these two partners that it's, in this relationship that they have as business partners, but they don't speak with each other because they cannot seem to agree. But they've been married because they have this partnership agreement and they do like aspects of the business, but they just simply don't want to talk. And so as a result of that, the employees with this dynamics, they don't know who to follow, right? They don't know really in terms of the direction of the business. And so there's a lot of confusion that's left within this organization for failure to communicate and failure to have a discussion to reach that mutual agreement. So there is a lot of dialogue, right? And really thinking about the dialogue is important in setting up these negotiations. And I'd like to talk about the 4 phases of the negotiation, because sometimes we never really think about it. We just know that, oh my gosh, we have this conversation that we have to have. I don't really want to do it, but you know what? It has to be done. But if we take a step back and look at it from what are the phases, and maybe break it down this way to help us prepare mentally, physically, you have a pre-negotiation phase. You have a conceptualization phase, settling on the details, and then a follow-up. So if we were to unpack some of these, what does that mean? If you think about from the pre-negotiation phase, I'd like to call this our pre-work, right? Because what we're doing here is preparing for ourselves, identifying who is going to be involved and what their role may or may not be. Maybe you're also looking at the location where you want to have this conversation and the time frame to allow it to fully occur, as well as developing an agenda. And we'll talk about more that takes place at this phase. During the conceptualization phase, we're framing issues, and it can also take place in terms of with another person, right, or the parties involved in this negotiation. You're putting the building blocks together to determine goals and objectives, and maybe formulating a basic concept of what an agreement might look like. Moving into settling on the details, because this is really where the proof is in the pudding. You've got a nice framework, you've thought things through before, but then this is also a delicate part of the process, because what you're looking at too is in terms of identifying challenges, problems, where implementations can break down, right? And really thinking through the how of what this really looks like. You're also even getting more deeper and entrenched in the details of what this agreement is. And sometimes legal might need to get involved if there's no way to remedy or find that mutual agreement. You also have a follow-up phase. And yes, you find the agreement, you work things out, you hammered out the details, everything's hunky-dory, pretend, maybe. But then also what happens is that it may require a renegotiation. So we can't just say, okay, everything's signed and dandy, let's put it on the shelf to collect dust. No, because things happen, life happens, right? Business happens. And sometimes those details that we discussed are altered, right? And they might need to be addressed to address these various challenging circumstances that come about. So the negotiation process, 4 phases, and you can flux in within these 4 phases at any time, right? But it is a continuous process that takes place and has to be nurtured in order for everyone to have that mutual agreeable outcome. So think about in those 4 phases, the pre-negotiation, conceptualization, settling in the details, and follow-up. Which part do we may not do as much or as often? Which part may we want to avoid altogether, right? And which part do we need to really think through more of to get the more desired outcome of what you want in that conversation and discussion? So as we think about the negotiation phases, there are negotiation styles. And I'd like to share with you 5 of the negotiation styles because you're competing, you're avoiding, accommodating, compromising, or collaborating. And these styles are driven by desired outcome and importance of maintaining a relationship. And the emphasis is going to change, or your style will change based upon if it's outcome based, relationship based, or both. So when you're talking about, say, competing, I win, you lose, right? That's the nature of the game. Remember, people are going to show up how they show up, but you can control what you would like to see come forth and come through in these negotiations. So when you're competing, I win, you lose, and you've been in those conversations where you can see where the person's position is. That's really where they're based upon solely on outcomes. The avoidance, I lose, you lose, I don't even want to deal with this. How can I get away from this, right? You don't even want to address it. When you're accommodating, you win, I lose, which means that, you know what, you can get everything that you want. I'm going to squash my needs so you can win. And again, maybe it's out of fear, right? And avoidance. I don't want to deal with this. Compromising, when you get to compromising and collaborating, this is where you're moving more to relationships and balancing the outcomes, right? Because in compromise, we understand that I'm going to win some, you're going to win some, I'm going to lose some, you're going to lose some, right? And so this is dance that we're constantly doing in this process. Also looking at around the collaborating piece, I win, you win. We found a mutual win-win situation where relationships, outcomes marry each other and everyone seems to be happy, relationship-based. Now, we can constantly fluctuate within these styles, right? And what might change the styles and approach that we utilize in negotiations can be in terms of where we are in the stage, right, of our negotiation. If your negotiators or the people involved in the negotiations are employing a different style that you might have never seen or they've never evoked before, right? It may cause you to take pause and say, okay, what else do I need to affect in this conversation to have it moving? Your role, if you're working in business or in professional, your role in the team and what that your role would be, because you've talked about the different styles and approaches, these strategies prior to going in, so that maybe you affect a different demeanor in terms of your style. And then also looking at it from the strategy and tactical goals that have been identified, right? And how do you move the needle to get closer to those goals? So the question that I have for the group, and if you're open to this, is, and you can definitely type your answers in the chat box if you'd like, is when you look at these 5 different styles, negotiating styles, which one do you typically move towards? What is your go-to style? And as you're thinking about that, I will share with what mine is that I mostly go towards, my default is relationships and looking at how to maintain and keep the relationship despite what's happening in conversation. So I would look at it from a compromising, collaborating style to affect first, right? Does anyone want to share?
Simone, I'm not sure if you can see the chat or if it was just sent to Savvy Ladies, but I'm seeing collaborate a few times and
great.
avoidance as well.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you. Yeah. So some of you are going on that part. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Sharon. Thank you for that insight. I'll give it another 30 seconds or so if anyone else wants to type in anything else. I can't see it, so definitely share.
Okay, and I'm just seeing another few come in, accommodate and compromise.
Great. Thank you. And so thinking about that in terms of the styles that you affect, what would cause you to shift to try something differently, right? And in saying that, especially those who mentioned being in avoidance phase, to look at it more in terms of conversation, dialogue, relationship based, and what would you need to do in terms of behaviors and styles to shift it so that way it doesn't come from avoidance, but maybe moving towards compromising and collaborating with the other persons involved. And that's going to depend upon, like I said, in terms of how you're progressing in the negotiation, as well as the person who's in front of you, right? Thank you for that. Okay. So the next question I have for the group is, what has been one of your biggest fears about entering into negotiations? And if you want to type it in the chat, I'll give you a couple minutes.
Simone, I'll just jump in as I see some answers coming in.
Thank you.
One of the responses is getting yelled at.
Yeah, thank you.
Another one I'm seeing is dealing with difficult people.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, and when we looked at some of the responses that came through, some people have stated fear, just fear of even thinking about a negotiation, being unprepared, right? Don't really know what to do, how to get started. Avoidance, right? Oh my gosh, this is like a big thing I don't want to deal with. Or also what came up too was not ready to understand the other party, meaning lack empathy, right? Because they maybe have one position that they've held and don't want to see it from the other person's position. So they say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this. Maybe lack patience because maybe it takes a long time to effect, as well as being rigid and lacking confidence. Those were some of the responses for the biggest fears about entering into negotiating situations. So thank you for that. The question I have then on the other side is, while you're in negotiations, you've jumped in, you're having these conversations, you're doing the back and forth. What have been some of the challenges that you've experienced in negotiations? You can enter your responses in the chat.
One of the responses, Simone, is seeing all sides clearly.
Got it. Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll keep checking if there are more responses, and I'll jump in and let you know.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I looked at a Harvard Business Review study that identified 3 challenges that women faced during negotiations. They mentioned balancing self-advocacy and community. The second one was managing difficult emotions. And the third one was overcoming interpersonal resistance. Let's look at the first one, balancing self-advocacy and community. And what they found, based on their responses within this research, is that women felt they had lack of confidence to ask, to make the ask. There was also this fear of putting their needs above others. And hence the reason there's this conflict of, do I ask for me, or do I help out for the community? In managing difficult emotions, what they found is that there's fear in negotiating there's a fear that the negotiations will end poorly. That was one of the things that resonated, as well as fear of becoming very emotional during the negotiations. The emotions start rising, you get triggered. And then 2, feeling hurt after the negotiations because maybe it didn't go their way. And so there was this kind of resentment towards, well, I should have, could have, would have. In the overcoming interpersonal resistance, what that really meant is how the other person showed up. Remember, we said we can't really control how that other person shows up. But what they found is that when the other person may not even show up for the negotiation, so missing the scheduled agreed to time. They also looked at the other person showing horror and surprise when an ask was being made, being volatile and unpredictable in order to create an environment that was uncertain and pessimistic. And these aggressive behaviors were intentional to derail and stall negotiations and put women on the back foot and discourage them from effectively stating their needs. So these were tactics that were intentionally done during the negotiations. But now if you realize that what they're really doing, right, and how it's being played out, coming up with strategies to address these, and we'll talk about that shortly. So what are some of the practices that we'd like to do for negotiations, right? One of the things in terms of the avoidance part of it is sitting, maybe doing the pre-work. When we talked about the pre-negotiations part of the negotiation, and really sitting down to identify what matters to you most. What are you really willing to give up? And what I call this is as your conditions of satisfaction, right? Because what you're looking at is the pie in the sky, everything goes well in that conversation. Here are all the things that I need. And in the same vein, if there is no negotiations that takes place whatsoever, right, what's the minimum of things that I need in order for me to move on and go forward, right? So what you're creating is your high. These are everything that I want to get, ideally. Your low, okay, if I can't get anything, these are the minimum things. And everything else in between the high and the low are things you can negotiate, right? But if you don't know what those barometers are and the boundaries are, then you can be all over the place in that conversation. You also want to do the research, right? Because you also want to reality test what's happening, whether you're going for a negotiation in terms of bonuses, raises, hiring, what is the reasonable offer, right? So that way you don't seem so out there when making these demands and asks. And you're also being prepared to ground yourself in specifics and perspectives of those details. During the negotiations, right, we talked about people trying to trigger you, get you emotionally riled. Thinking about focus on the problem, not the person. Because now you're taking the emotions out of the conversation and focusing purely on the facts. And when you focus purely on the facts, you've done your research. You know what you need. And you can refocus and ignore all those antics that are being pulled in that conversation to ensure that you're moving the conversation to where you need to go. And another person mentioned in terms of not fully understanding all perspectives, this is where listening comes into play. And you're actively listening, not listening to wait to speak, right? Because what you're really trying to understand is, what does that other person want? This is where you evoke empathy as well as curiosity. You're asking why. Why or why not? Because what you want to understand is this person has a position that they've entered into this conversation with, right? This is the position, is the thing that they've decided upon, and this is the interest that's causing them to do these actions, behaviors, right? But you want to get under the hood and understand why. And this is where you start asking some questions and start listening actively. You also, creating that win-win scenario, creating options where you both can benefit. And this, again, emotional intelligence, adaptability, flexibility, getting curious, right? So that way, during this dance, you've identified in the pre-work what you want, where the pieces of where you want to negotiate within that realm of your boundaries, right? So that way, when you're giving things away, it seems as if, oh, it meant so dear to you, but I'm willing to compromise to move us closer to a win-win. Also, knowing when to walk away. We're not going down with the ship, the Titanic, right? Meaning that we're not going to get attached because it is a conversation and we're taking our emotions out of this conversation to allow us to be rational, right? And I say that because if it is the outcome or relationship depends upon how you exit. If it's relationship based, you say, politely, I don't think this is going to work right now for us, but I would love to be able to collaborate with you in the future, right? Outcomes-based can be anything. Nowadays, they ghost people. So it, it can be all over the place in terms of how that means. But if it's relationship-based, we're not going down with the Titanic, right? We're not getting attached. We're not putting emotions into the conversation. We're listening actively to understand the cues, to understand how we'd like to move forward in relationship or not, right? And that's totally your choice. But remember, too, you're analyzing this person for a variety of things, right? Values. Are they being challenged? What's triggering you around this in the conversation, right? And are you asking the questions necessary to help move you forward, or are they trying to derail this whole conversation? And you're getting all of that information by asking the questions, listening actively, and really getting under the hood to their why. When we looked at the Harvard Business Review and going back to those three unique challenges that women face in negotiations, in balancing self-advocacy and community, strategies were labels, right? Women were being labeled as being perceived as too assertive or too caring. And so one of the things that came up was around how do we show that we understand the needs of the other person and then be more assertive for your own ask and self-advocacy. And it came down to reframing the issue, right? Because by opening a negotiation, you're laying out broader issues to show that, one, you understand the other's perspective. But you're not forgetting yourself in that conversation, right? What you are doing, too, is showing the benefit to you and the others, right? So, for example, if you're at work, you are strapped for resources, you know that you need additional help, human capital, maybe you're framing the statement as, hiring an additional staff member on the team will help the team achieve X as opposed to I need, right? Because now you're saying I understand the perspectives of everyone. I'm identifying some of the key issues that are taking place by not having this, and this is how we can benefit. So really it's around the empathy piece, but also having the confidence to make sure that you are not left behind in that conversation. What you're also doing, the second piece was around managing difficult emotions, right? We said we want to keep the emotions out of the conversation. We're focusing more on the problem. So think about in terms of how do we prepare for setbacks and challenges, right? Maybe simulating different ways an interaction could unfold and playing that over in your head. Good, better, worse, right? Good, bad, ugly, and having some things about to support you when you see those coming up in the conversation. Preparing how the other person might resist your ask and be ready to respond with additional information. This is the research piece, right? So again, you're playing out the scenarios, the what ifs, and then what other supporting additional information do you have to provide. Then also, again, keep the emotions out of the conversation, but as you're in the conversation, and maybe at the end, reflecting on what worked and what didn't work, and what will you take as part of the things that worked for you to move to other conversations and negotiations. So what we're doing is really building that muscle to enabling us to understand where our areas of development are needed in that conversation. And what else do we need to do to help strengthen that muscle so that way we're more effective every time we go into a negotiation. The third piece was overcoming interpersonal resistance and what was needed for that. And in terms of really, truly, it's about building up our grit, right? Get the grit going. So it's not taking these conversations personally. I know sometimes we can, but if we are not taking it personally, if it's a business business interaction, we're not taking it personally, but understanding that the person has decided upon a certain stance and position in this conversation. How can we be flexible and adaptable, right, to ensure that we're getting what we need and not left behind and moving towards that mutual agreeable state? Again, getting curious and asking why and why not, because again, you're unpeeling, unraveling, and getting more information to help you strengthen your position and help move the conversation. Now, sometimes you can do all of these things and the conversation is just stalemate, right? And that may be due to the other person not willing to budge, right? But if you've done everything in your capacity to try to get to that mutual agreement and it's not being seen by the other person, then that's where you may need to get mediators and other people involved. So, how we set ourselves up for success in this process, right? And thinking about from what are you setting out your objectives and goals prior to, right? And what outcomes do you want at the end? And thinking that through, right? Thinking through the different possibilities and scenarios that can take place to get you there. Also, ask yourself, are you focused on the outcome or is the relationship more important to you? Because then that also enables you to figure out which style do you evoke and when. Emotional intelligence becomes very important in conversations, right? Because we're listening for what the other person needs. We're getting curious by asking questions because it fuels us with additional information to help us and our position. And then also understanding, right? So that way we understand what they need, we understand their position, because if we don't understand what their position is, we've lost already, right? And because if you're going in with just one thing within that negotiation, you've already lost. So it's very important to really understand and step into the other person's shoes to see what they're seeing, feeling, right, and why, to then understand how best to, one, prepare yourself for your negotiations and your positioning, but also how to best be more adaptable and flexible. Find areas that you may want to, to collaborate more on, compromise on, to give up, to move forward. Then I mentioned the conditions of satisfaction, knowing what you want. Always go in knowing what you want, but make sure you go in with more than one thing, right? Things that you want to negotiate, things that are on your base, things that you can give away. And thinking about that in terms of that list of where things might fall on your prioritization. And then learning about what are some of the key takeaways that and thinking about your past experience with negotiations, right? And what were some of the things that worked for you and what things didn't work for you and why? Thinking about what areas were you triggered and why, and how best to, if you get very emotional, be more reserved, right, and more focused on the problem. Maybe it's about listening more actively, right, and taking notes to ensure you're not missing anything and stay focused, right? So those are some of the things that to think about for your next negotiation. So when you think about it from the muscle that you have to flex in negotiations, it is a conversation, it's a discussion, right? And we're trying to reach that mutual agreeable outcome. We can't always control the circumstances, the situation, or how others show up. But by doing the legwork around the pre-negotiation piece, the adaptability piece during negotiations, and knowing what you want at the end will help you become more successful in your negotiation. What I will do is open up for any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Simone. I'll remind everyone, if you have a question, you can use the chat box or you can email info@savvyladies.org. And I do see that we had a question come in, Simone, okay. And the first one's asking, or it's saying, I really need time to think about things. Sometimes negotiation conversations need to be done right in the moment. Is there a way that I can ask for more time to make a decision?
Okay, great. Buying more time. Absolutely, because sometimes people want you to make a rash decision. And if it's something where, you can ask them to say, I'd love to hear your positions about this. And if it's a time and a moment where it's not conducive for you to have a conversation, have them send you the information so you can take a look at it and digest it and come back to you. If it's something where they want something impulsively, then you say, you know what, I want to listen to both sides and really take a 360 perspective. When can we sit down and have a conversation about it? So that way they're not dictating how you make decisions, but now you're getting in control. Remember, we talked about in terms of the timing, the place where you want to have it, and making sure that you have the wherewithal and thoughts to prepare what you want and what you see prior to just making rash decisions and comments.
Okay.
I hope that was helpful.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks. Moving on to another question, which is asking, my assistant recently asked me about making her work schedule more flexible now that her children have more after-school activities. She's always been very hardworking, but we're heading into our busy season, and I'm worried that things won't get done at work. Do you have some tips for how I can negotiate with her? I've been thinking about asking her to log in remotely or check emails at home, but I'd love to hear some tips from you.
Sure. Is this the first time that you're allowing this type of work style? And if it is, there are ways where you may not want to go all in to it at once, but maybe setting up some initial a trial period to see how things work, especially around the communications, deliverables that are being reached, and ways through which you have access to this person. So I would, if it's the first time that you're diving into a work relationship like this in terms of remote work, start off small in terms and ensuring that you have some process and systems in place and you work out those kinks, and then as you know, more confidence and the deliverables are being met, and then you can increase accordingly. But I would have a trial period on certain key areas like communication, which is going to be key, access, which is going to be key, deliverables around it, and making sure that those things are hammered out in terms of the how before plunging all in.
Okay, great. And I'm just seeing in the chat that yes, it's the first time.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
that's helpful. I'll move on to the next question, if you're ready for that one, which is, have you ever been in a negotiation and the person who's on your team to support you then gets excited by the company and goes to negotiate something that you didn't discuss? If so, how would you handle that?
Yep. Yeah, and you know, that's part of the pre-negotiation piece where we're looking at the people who are going to be involved and what their roles are and really laying out how things unfold. So it appears that, I don't know if that was done or not, and maybe they just jumped the gun, but there should have been some conversations around who does what in terms of communication, who does what in terms of note-taking, so that way everyone understands what they see, what they hear, and how the decision-making process would be made with the other person. So that would be part of the pre-work that would be hammered out prior to going into the meeting, and maybe doing some role-play scenarios around that to ensure that everyone understands their role, how things are going to be done, and the approach of the team fully.
Okay, great. And this might be the last question, which is saying, I'm getting an offer and it's below what I'm willing to accept for this role because there's no bonus on this role. How can I handle this negotiation in a tactful way so that if I decline the offer, I don't damage the relationship with the company I'm applying to with this recruiter?
Sure. Well, here's the thing, right? Because if we're going in with one thing to negotiate, we've already lost. And so when I look at it from the salary piece, what other things are there that you can negotiate if they're not going to budge on the salary, right? Because you have your benefits, you have other perks that can be utilized. So taking a look at their full package comprehensively and doing apples to apples comparison to see if there are other things that you can add to make it nicer if that's what you'd like to do. However, state your position also in terms of letting them know what the going rate in the marketplace is for what you're doing, right? And you have all the information out there to do that. And if it's something that they're not willing to budge, then you're going to say, you know what, I'd love to, unfortunately, this is not going to be working for myself and family, and then move on to something else. I had a client where that happened to them. They were offered another position, but it was done in lowball them in terms of their salary, and they said, I love the company, I love what we're doing, but it's not going to be right for my family. They turned around and offered her a different position maybe a couple months ago later at the salary range that she was looking for. So, looking at it from that perspective, taking a comprehensive view to compare apples to make sure that if there are other things that can be added to make it sweeter for you. And at the end of the day, if they're not moving and budging on that salary piece, then it's just, say, I love the company. I think this is great. Unfortunately, it's just not going to work out for myself and family. And then keep in contact afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Those look like all the questions that we have. So did you want to talk about the information on this slide here?
Sure. Thank you. I have a book, Achieving Results, and I have the link there that you can access that provides some really interesting tips around how to navigate teams and people. My website is there, yourchoicecoach.com. Please feel free. I'm also offering a free consult, so if you have any questions around negotiations or in negotiations and you'd like to have a thought partner around it, please reach out. I'm offering a free 15 minutes for savvy ladies. And a hot nugget just on additional information on negotiation. So thank you.
Okay, great. And we will, of course, send all of this information in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you have to quickly write everything down. We'll be sending it out soon. So I want to thank you, Simone, for a really excellent presentation, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today and asking lots of questions. As I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email, and we hope you'll be joining us again for future webinars. So thank you so much, Simone. It was really great.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.